Feeling stuck on an iPhone app bug? Don't worry, I've got your back. In this Xcode 16 debugging tutorial, I'll walk you through how to troubleshoot and fix your problems like a pro. We'll dive into breakpoints, variable inspection, and a simple 4-step method to tackle even the hardest bug. Plus, if you stick around, I'll share my secret trick for solving a real bug that had me stumped for days. Yes, even in 2025. I'm Paul Solt, a former Apple engineer, and my code is in apps like GoPro Quik. Let's get started. We're going to start with a broken feature that refuses to add new items. So I have this sample project here that I use to work on my Swift data and CloudKit integration. And I just opened it up and it's not working. So I want to give you a tutorial on how to use the Xcode 16 debugger, on how to find this issue. Then we'll learn all about the different features here. And at the very end, I will show you a quick shortcut that can help you identify a problem quickly. So let's try and reproduce this problem. So if I hit the plus button, nothing is getting added. And so there's a couple of different things that could be happening here. This could be a observable issue with our data model. It could be a Swift data issue. It could be a cloud sync issue with CloudKit. It could be that this isn't actually connected anymore. So there's a lot of different things that could be. And so when we're encountering a bug, we have to make a hypothesis of how we might fix it. But it's also helpful to follow a debugging method. And so I'm going to teach you a debugging method called the Rift debugging method. Reproduce, investigate, fix, and test. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to try and reproduce the problem. If you can't reproduce the problem reliably, it's going to be harder to fix. Next, we're going to investigate, okay, what is the related code? Can we inspect the variables? Can we step line by line? And that's where the debugger in Xcode is really going to assist us. The third step is fix. We're going to implement the necessary changes that are going to solve the problem. So we want to be able to see more items in this list. I think right now, the only thing I can do is I can delete and they go away. I do have undo, so that's going to undo something. And then we can redo. So that's working, but the feature to add new things is not working. And then the last thing is test. We're going to make sure that after we make our fix, that the bug doesn't exist anymore and that no new issues are caused from our fix. So let's step through that process: reproduce, investigate, and fix. We've done step one. Now let's go into investigate, and we're going to leverage the Xcode debugger to do a lot of this heavy lifting. So the bottom panel down here, this is the debug area. And this is going to have some controls along the top here. And the primary ones that we're going to use are these 4 buttons. And you'll see that I have insert here. Insert is just because I'm in Vim mode, which is this option right here. If you don't know what Vim is or VI, don't turn that on because you're not going to know how to edit your text. First, going to have to now investigate. So we know sort of where this is, but how do we find this code? When you're working on a large project, it's really hard to find the code that you need to work on. On a smaller project, you know exactly where it is if you've written the code. But when you are on a large code base with maybe millions of lines of code, you need to have an approach that's going to allow you to find not only this screen, but this button. In this example, it's pretty straightforward. We've got a list view, so we just need to find the UI that has the list view. But if I were searching a bigger code base, I would do Command-Shift-F, which is the search project. And this allows us to find text containing. And here we could search for add and see all results, and that would help us narrow down some stuff. Or we could search for the icon, which I think I might have used from Swift UI or SF symbols. And if we search plus, like here, we can find it. Also, if we search edit, we might be able to find something that cues us to this. So we see there's an edit button as well. So taking us to that is going to take us to the toolbar. So this is our first step in investigating. And now we're looking for a hook where we can put a breakpoint. A breakpoint is this little blue flag that we can just add on the gutter on top of our line numbers. And you can get rid of them by dragging them away and they go away. This is a button. It has a function called add item. So let's jump to definition. We can right click on this symbol and say jump to definition, or we can hold the command key and click and we'll see a little Mickey Mouse hand. And if we click, we are taken to the add item function. So this is where we're going to be looking to see if we can find the problem. Now, already I see that I'm doing something with animation. So animation could be another thing causing this to fail. We don't know yet. So let's look at the code. I'm going to be creating a new recipe by taking an existing recipe and copying it. Then potentially I am going to randomize and create a copy of a different recipe. So this allows me to have either a Hario or a Chemex recipe. And then we're seeing that the date modified is getting set to now. The coffee weight is a random number that's getting added to one of these values. And then we are seeing that we're going to append it to the list. So it's finding how many items there are in the recipes and it's adding one. And then it's using that as a sort order so that we can maintain a consistent sort order. And then it's inserting it into the model. So Swift Data should be getting this, and we see that it's saving. Now, this could be failing and we are ignoring a potential error by just doing the try question mark. We could do a do catch statement here if we think that that is the problem to see if it is not saving correctly. All right, so let's set a breakpoint. I'm gonna click on line 212, and then I'm gonna click on line 217, and then I'm gonna click on 223 just to have some breakpoints. Now, I'm also going to show you some keyboard shortcuts. When we set these breakpoints and we run the app again, actually we don't need to necessarily run the app after setting those breakpoints because I think it was already running. We could just hit the plus key to trigger this action at this point. So here we're going to see that our breakpoint is here. And if you've ever seen this thread 1 breakpoint 1.1, that means we hit a breakpoint. Over on the left, you're going to see your stack frame. On the bottom, we're going to see our variable view. And then right where I am around me, we're going to see the lldb debug area. And I'm just move that up so that you can sort of see what we're working with here. Okay. So whenever we do this, if I step over, we're going to have different variables that are on the stack. So we are currently in a closure and there is a new variable that's been defined called recipe. As soon as we step over line 212, we jump down to 215. This variable exists. We can hover over it and we can get details about it, or we can look down here and we can expand this and see details about this. This is a Swift data object. So there are going to be property wrappers or macros that have created IVAR variables or instance variables that are the backing store for the property itself. So they're going to all start with an underscore. And if we were to jump over to my coffee recipe, you would see that this is a Swift data object with these titles. So we have some context. Now, as we're stepping, we're going to use this step over command to go one line at a time. And so that's going to update things. So if I step over this line, we should see that the date modified is going to change. Then let's try and print out the date modified. So there's two commands that we can use here. We could use the PO command and we could print out a recipe if it supports it. And we might see some details about it. Or there's the P command that we can run. Now, sometimes these take a little bit of time. On a bigger project, they can also take a little bit of time. I think I pressed enter, but it's not doing anything. So let's just try pressing enter one more time. Okay, apparently I didn't press enter. So here we're gonna see coffee recipe. Now this is doing print object. PO stands for print object, and recipe is a object. If we jump to definition, it's a class, so this is an object, but there is no method implemented for a debug print. So that is something that we could add if we wanted to see custom things. It's kind of like custom string convertible, but there's a custom debug string convertible. And so that would be one way that we could, if we overrode either of those, we should see more information rather than just a memory address where this object is stored. Okay, so the P command may be more useful in some situations. So we could try that next, and pressing enter, that's going to show us all of these things. Now, that's not super insightful because we're not seeing actual values here. So if we want to get actual values, let's try doing P and then recipe dot, and we want to look at date modified. All right, so date modified is 120 and at 1357. And if we step over this line, let's see if that date changes. So I stepped over the line so that the date should have been modified. And we can do P recipe dot date modified. And what do we see? We see that it has a different time because it's now 9 a.m. This is a UTC time, so it's going to be on 24-hour time. And so you have to add, in this case, it looks like 5 hours based on my time zone. Okay, so we've just seen how a variable can be modified. this view is not super useful because we're dealing with a Swift data object. So we're not gonna worry too much about this, but it might be useful for different cases. So we're gonna keep jumping, jump, jump, jump. So now we should see that sort order has been updated. And if we, let's just see, this is another, so this is, well, that's interesting. That says 0. So that's kind of odd. Not sure if that's related, but we're just gonna keep on going. So I'm gonna step over and I'm gonna cross my fingers that this is adding something to our model context. Let's do a PO on the recipes. So I know that I have a list of recipes that is powering this list. So let's print that out and we see only 2 things, and that's a little bit concerning, but maybe this logic hasn't all finished. So let's hit continue and let's try this one more time, but we didn't see anything appear, so that's problematic. Let's print this out one more time and we see that we still only have 2 things. So at this point, when I was trying to debug this live in front of my office hours, I was thoroughly confused because I had just literally added something and it wasn't appearing in the list, and I hadn't seen something like this before. So what can we do to dig a little deeper? Well, we have to understand the context of the change I made. So I made a change to this logic for my brew coffee app. So this is the actual app that Swift data is powering. I have 2 recipes in this coffee pour over app. I have a Hario V60 and I have a Chemex. The feature that I added to support this, it's not fully finished yet, but I have an option to reset a recipe to default. And I added this because I wanted save and cancel ability to modify a recipe. So a coffee recipe has timing associated as well as coffee amounts, water amounts, coffee to water ratio, and bloom ratio. All of these things go into a pour over recipe. It's a chemistry experiment. And so as I'm modifying this, there's a chance that if I'm a beginner, I might totally trash a recipe and make something that's not going to taste good. And if I were to make these changes, I needed a way to protect the user or customer so they could get back to a known recipe which is going to taste good. So the reset recipe to default was my solution to that. So if I save this now, we're not going to see any changes, but we can still modify this using our drag gestures. And then we could start a coffee brew. And if we hit continue, this is doing actually an in-app purchase, but that doesn't make any sense, only because I changed this during office hours. And that is in my iPhone Apps 101 course. So this is the app. I gave you the backstory. So now if we jump back to the demo, what is going on in this application? So we're gonna switch and go back to, this is the brains for all of the data saving. This is my test bed to make sure that it was working. So if we're back in here, we're creating a copy and let's turn off breakpoints. We can do that with Command Y, and you'll see that all of our breakpoints on screen go white. And then this little icon here goes empty. If we do Command Y, we're gonna see that they turn on, turn off, turn on, turn off. So that's a quick way to turn them off. If we hit the continue button, that will resume program execution. So let's hit play. And let's just try and hit this a couple more times. Now you're gonna notice when these are disabled, if you are triggering the bug, you're not gonna see your breakpoints get hit. So at this point, I'm a little confused because it sure looks like we're inserting, it sure looks like we're saving, it sure looks like we're creating a valid recipe. Why doesn't it work? Let's investigate what are our recipes list. Let's jump to definition on recipes. And we're gonna see that I am using the Swift data query property wrapper. This takes a filter, this has a sort, and this has an order. So let's try changing something. So we're still trying to see what's wrong. We're gonna comment out the filter and see if that's causing a problem. And lo and behold, that was our problem. So now I have a ton of things, but it's a little confusing because some of these are default and some of these are not. So these are false on default recipes. These are true on default recipes, and that's not what I anticipated. So something's wrong with my logic on the recipe creation. Now I alluded to something that's gonna help save you time. Whenever you're encountering a problem like this and you don't understand, my first go-to is to search Google and to say something like Swift data and Swift UI. And then this is going to be a list, not updating with new item. So I would search something like this, and then I would start looking at these different problems and see if they're related. So here we see there's a query. This kind of looks like this might be insightful to read. So someone's got an example of how to do it. So that's kind of cool. So that might be a good thing. Here's another one. I don't know if this is related, but I would start scrolling through this, looking to see if there's anything here. Okay, so those are two potential things that we could investigate, and they're gonna take a little bit of time to look at the code and understand them. But that might not be the problem. And so one of my new approaches is really to lean heavily into ChatGPT. ChatGPT can really be a debugging partner. And traditionally, programmers have this concept called rubber ducking, which means they talk to some inanimate object like a duck or maybe a stapler, and they try to explain the problem to them. And sometimes the act of doing that explanation can help you figure out what the actual problem is. Well, we can do the same type of thing with ChatGPT, and it can provide some ideas, or it could even inspect some of the code and suggest things that are going to be highly relevant, which is almost like having a partner as you're coding. All right, so I'm paying for ChatGPT, but you can use the 4.0 and you've got a limited number of requests. I found a lot of value in the $20 a month ChatGPT, and right now I'm experimenting with the Pro mode, so I am paying $200 a month as well. With the 4.0, you can still ask questions. Now, this is where you want to be a little bit careful. If this is for work, you're not going to want to paste work code, and there's an option here to turn on temporary chat so it doesn't save anything. Now, whether this is doing anything else behind the scenes with your code that you submit, I don't know. So I would still be leery if it's code that you're not allowed to post unless you have a private version of some kind of AI that you can query. For this, I want to know, okay, why is this not working? So I'm going to go into my test project, and this is where it's useful to make like a sample project if you're really stuck. If I uncomment this change that we did that seems to have helped fix the problem but isn't the solution yet, it's sort of given us insight that there's something wrong with this default recipe, we can copy all of the code with Command C, and we can jump on over to Safari. And here we can ask Safari, why is my Swift UI and Swift data app not adding new values? And we could just leave it at that. We could give it more insight. I'm just going to do Shift Enter to go to a new line, and then I'm going to paste with Command V all of that code. Now I am doing a temporary chat, and I should have clicked this button to start, but I was already on it with ChatGPT 4.0. So let's go ahead and hit the send button, and let's see what ChatGPT suggests. So she's gonna, or it is going to suggest a bunch of different things, and this is actually really insightful. So in the query field, to confirm that the property names match your model, and if default recipe or sort order doesn't exist or is misconfigured in coffee recipe, the query will fail. Okay, so these different things are going to give us some insights. There's 7 different things that we could try, and we didn't get any of that from Google. We got starting points, but this gave us a list of things that we could do. So I highly recommend leveraging AI to give you assistance. You don't have to necessarily give it your code. You could say just the start of that, why doesn't my Swift UI list update with Swift data when I add a new item using a query? Okay, if we trash this, so if I just say, what is it? If I click on here, turn this off, let's turn this back on. If we just act this without any context, we can get some insight without having to share our code. So that's another option that you have, and this is going to suggest different things. All right, so right here, this is related to our problem, number 7. So highly useful to use AI to assist you as you're trying to debug issues. Okay, let's go back to the code and let's use the debugger to figure out what's going on here. I'm going to bring this back down, and we're going to go back to the coffee recipe list. I'm going to use Command / to find all of our changed code, and we don't have any change code because I've undone that one change on line 66. I don't want this to be true, like default recipe is equal to false is the predicate that I want to filter the content, which probably means we have a bug if we scroll all the way back down to add item. am I doing something wrong in here? So let's dive into one of these recipes, jump to definition. I have two static recipes that are just sort of baked into the application. And if we look in here, we're gonna see default recipe is true, default recipe is true. So this is our problem. We're copying a recipe that is a default recipe, but we're not configuring all the properties that are important. And this is a new property I added. And that means that maybe we need to do something like recipe.default recipe is equal to false. So let's try this. Let's run it again and see what happens. All right, so now we see that it adds that. That's great, and we can delete and we can undo. So I think we've just figured out the fix for our problem. We can redo. It seems to be working. We can dive into one of these. We can modify the weight. We can hit save, and it's gonna save that value. Great. Now, the other side effect is if we comment out this filter on the query, we have a lot of data that we don't wanna ship with the app. All of this stuff is invalid default recipes. So I want to clean that up. And so to do something like that, I'm going to need to do something in my data container to get to a sort of a known state again. So I have a line here on line 34 to reset all data with my Swift data as well as my user defaults. We can see that function right here. So it's going to reset my user settings and it's going to delete all data. It's not in a state where we can add stuff. So I need to make sure I only run this once and I need to comment it out. This is just for debug, testing, and cleanup. We're gonna run it one more time and now we should see all of the recipes. Now, I talked about having two default recipes as the starting point and then creating a copy of them for user changes. So when the user changes this recipe, they can save it. And then if they don't like that, now you see there's a reset to default. Let's see if that works. Reset to default will fix this recipe and it will go back to this default recipe. All right, so that seems to have fixed it. Now let's fix the query. We'll jump back over to our code and let's uncomment this with command / and we'll run it one more time and we should see that we fixed the problem. So let's go ahead and add. And so now we've added a new recipe. We can delete this recipe. These two recipes are our default recipes that the app Brew Coffee is going to ship with. So those are always going to be here. If I were to delete all the recipes and we were to rerun the application, there should be logic to re-add them, but it looks like it's not adding them because there's still the two default recipes that we can't see. So clicking the plus has now fixed our problem. So that's an example of the Rift debugging method. So we've talked about reproducing, investigating, fixing, and then testing to solve the problem using Xcode's debug areas. The debug areas down here, we can turn on and off the variable view or the console view over on the far right corner. And we can use these buttons to step into, to step over, and to step out of our different stack frame. Click the like button if you learned something new. And if you want access to the code, join my iPhone Apps 101 course down in the description where I will have some of this code as well as other lessons on working with Swift UI.